guys, welcome to our final chapter of Boston Jane Wilderness Days. We are on chapter 18, or A Patch of Land. Cruxo's new friend, Spark, let us travel in her family's canoe, so the journey home was completed in 2 easy days. "You're gonna be the death of me, Jane," Jehu said in a low voice as we paddled along. He was furious with me. "What if Black had shot you?" "But he didn't," I said, and I was grateful. Jehu and the other men had come looking for me when Mr. Russell and I had not turned up. And while I was thankful that they had saved Mr. Russell's life, I was thankful for other things too. However, we had returned to the negotiations just in time to see them fall apart one more time. The governor, who had clearly woken up irritable, immediately launched into Tlayak, yelling at him quite forcefully and blaming him for starting all the fights the evening before. And then, before the startled Tlayak could say anything in his own defense, sorry, it's a Native American word that I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, the governor, in front of everyone, ripped up the piece of paper the government had given Tlayak, recognizing him as Tai. Okay, so he's the new chief. The whole of the campground went silent in astonishment that the governor would insult a Tai in such a manner. I glanced over and saw that William had a most disconcerting, satisfied look on his face. But Tlayak was deadly calm. In a quiet voice, he told the governor that he still spoke for his people and that there would be no treaty. And before the governor could react, Indians from most of the assembled tribes were starting to leave. The meeting was over. William's stunned expression at this pronouncement was priceless. His machinations had come to naught. Now there would be no reservation for anyone in the near future. So it was a very happy and boisterous party that left for our little settlement on Shoalwater Bay. Mr. Russell's cabin seemed like a warm, glowing beacon in the middle of a storm. Father Joseph, McCarty, and Holm were waiting for us when we returned. Tired and cranky and rather smelly, I confess. "Jehu, Cruxo," Holm said, relief clear on her face. "We were so worried." "She's just buttering us up to finish that roof, eh?" Jehu teased, nudging Cruxo in the ribs. I was enveloped in a hug of warm wool. "Mademoiselle," Father Joseph said, his voice catching. I blinked in surprise at the emotion rushing through me at the show of affection. "Good to have you back, Russell," McCarty roared, clapping Mr. Russell on the back. Mr. Russell grinned at him like a young boy. "Good to be back." Brandywine leaped up, licking me, and then little Sooty was gripping my leg. I just stood there and smiled into Jehu's blue eyes. That first night back is one I shall never forget. "A party," Mr. Swan proposed. Mr. Russell's cabin had never seemed as warm and welcoming in all the months I had been there, nor the company so perfect. I remember the sweet sound of laughter and Brandywine's happy barks, and how Mr. Swan pulled out a fiddle and struck up a tune, and Jehu swung me around and around, and my heart filled to bursting with happiness. In that moment, as I was being spun in the arms of the man who loved my ratty, tangled hair, I knew I had found a family as loving and warm and dear as Papa and Mrs. Parker. A rather eccentric family, I conceded, but still, I rather think Papa would have approved of such a group outlaws everyone. And then Mr. Russell, to everyone's surprise, pulled me out to dance and swung me around skillfully. The glowing fire shined on his face, turning his gray beard red, and for a brief moment I saw what he must have looked like as a young man, all earnest and eager to find his fortune in the mountains of the unknown frontier. "You're a fine dancer," I complimented as he dipped and twirled and spun me until I was dizzy. "And you're a fine gal," he said softly, his eyes serious. It was the closest to thanks I would ever get for saving his life, but those few words meant more to me than the sweetest flattery from the most accomplished gentleman's lips. And perhaps I thought, what's wrong?
Mommy,
what?
That spider came back. I just saw it creeping.
Okay, I'll get it in a second.
It was like moving so fast.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. And perhaps I thought that was what being the lady was all about, knowing the true value of a gift. The next morning found me in the cabin sewing clothes for the rag doll I had never given to Sooty. If I gave it some proper clothes, it would look good enough to give to her, although it would never be as fine as the china doll from Mrs. Frink. There was a soft knock on the cabin door. "Come in," I called, never looking up. "Oh, Miss Pack, you're back." We were all so concerned about you, Mrs. Frink said. She stood hesitantly in the doorway, the light framing her petite figure. I managed a small smile. Please come in. I milked Burton while you were away, she said. The poor dear was mooing so loudly that Mr. Frink and I could barely sleep. I winced. She smiled at me in her earnest way. What is that you're working on? A doll, I said reluctantly, for Sooty. How very clever of you. Mrs. Frink came over, studying my handiwork. She eyed the small wardrobe I had sewn thus far, a calico dress, an apron, a cloak, a nightdress. She clapped her hands together happily. I know just the thing. She disappeared from the cabin, returning a moment later with a small bundle in her hands. Here, she said, thrusting it forward. I took it reluctantly. I untied the bundle and out spilled velvet and soft linen and smooth silks. There were ornate, tiny, beautiful embroidered dresses. They were perfect knitted caps, socks and mittens and crisp nightdresses, everything a fashionable, well-dressed doll could desire. I adore this one, Mrs. Frink said, fingering a peach velvet smock with cross-stitch embroidery around the hem. It took ages to sew the lace on just right. She must have labored for months and months to create these perfect little clothes. The calico dress I had sewn looked crude next to them. The cloak was pathetic. The apron, like the handkerchief it was, had I truly expected to best Mrs. Frink? A sense of despair welled up in me as I looked from each perfect piece to the next. Mrs. Frink had not stopped talking. I dearly hope our furniture arrives soon, she said. Furniture? Why, yes. I had our furniture shipped around the Cape. Mr. Frink was quite insistent that we travel overland to get here. He so wanted to see the country, but I tell you, I very much wish we had gone by sea. I prefer a sea voyage any day. I'm a good sailor, she finished firmly. I came on ship, I said, not wanting to add that I had spent most of the voyage puking in a bucket. Mrs. Frink studied me, stroking a small pair of socks. You're from Philadelphia, aren't you? I thought I recognized the accent. Do you have relations there still? My throat felt thick. My papa's dead. He was all I ever had. Mrs. Frink's hand slowly put the socks back in the pile. I'm very sorry for your loss, Miss Peck. I couldn't stop the bitter words that escaped my lips. I'm all alone, I said. A shadow passed over Mrs. Frink's flushed face. Oh, dear, we are never alone. Even when we lose a loved one, we must remember that they are still there watching us. Why, I tell Mr. Frink that all the time. Mr. Frink, I say, I believe our little baby Lila is smiling down at us from heaven, even though she is buried beneath that rock on the trail west of Fort Laramie. Yes, she is in heaven, and she is smiling down on us this very moment, so there is no reason to cry. Her smile was strained, and it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I said. I looked down at the tiny clothes in my hand. These weren't doll clothes at all. They were baby clothes for a baby who would never wear them. That's super sad. So on their travel west, their baby died. I looked up at Mrs. Frink, a woman I had thought perfect, and something in me softened. I had been wrong about her, too. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Frink. Truly I am. I wanted to say I was sorry for misjudging her, but I think she knew. So am I, Miss Peck, she whispered, her lower lip trembling. More than I can ever say. I believe these shall make Sooty very happy, I said, smoothing one of the tiny embroidered dresses. I'm so very glad, she said, swallowing hard, and you must please call me Matilda. I shall, Matilda, I said, if you will call me Jane. Mrs. Frink nodded, marshalling her charm. Well then, Jane, I was wondering if you would be willing to help me with something. She clasped her hands together and leaned forward, confidingly. I'm afraid that I'm quite desperate for the good opinion of another lady. So then time passes. Mrs. Frink hired me to help run the hotel. I would be specifically in charge of designing the menu of the dining room and acting as local liaison. The hotel's initial clientele would be new settlers and gentlemen looking for opportunities in the territory, but the Frinks were quite optimistic that the hotel would attract tourists in time. After all, Mrs. Frink declared, who can resist the beautiful beach? The hotel was scheduled to open its doors to guests in the early spring. In the meantime, I would be kept busy assisting Mrs. Frink in outfitting the guest rooms with linen and wallpaper and all manner of things that we ordered from California. She wanted my opinions on all these matters, and I found that my education at Miss Hepplewhite's Young Ladies Academy, which had been generally of little use on the frontier, proved indispensable in this regard. One afternoon, as I started out for the hotel to look at new set of fabric swatches that had arrived, Jehu grabbed my arm. You're coming with me, he announced. I have to go see Mrs. Frink, I protested. I informed her that you have very important engagement, he said mysteriously. He dragged me out to his plot of land by the bay. It was a cool January and the wind was whipping us along. This is it, Jehu said as we stood on the cliff he had brought me to mere months ago. Yes, I know. What did you bring me out here for? I have my reasons, he said, and slapped a folded piece of paper in my hand. What's this? Read it, Jane, he urged, a note of excitement in his voice. I carefully unfolded the paper. Grant for 120 acres of land to J. Peck, December 22nd, 1854. When I looked up, his eyes were dancing. Well, how do you like your patch of land? My land? Yes, your land. That's a land grant for you. Thought I'd build you a house of your own. Mine'll be over here, he said, pointing. And then in time, maybe we could... He cleared his throat nervously. Well, you know. I looked at Jehu, astonished by the depth of misunderstanding. That day, when he had brought me up here, he had not been trying to marry me for land. He had been trying to help me claim a piece of land for my own, next to his claim, so I wouldn't feel scared or nervous, but my land all the same. I studied the document more closely. J. Peck? They'll never know. You could be a Jonathan or Jack or a Jebediah or a Jane, I finished dryly. He leaned over and kissed me so softly that for a moment all I heard was the roaring of the waves, or was it my heart? You'll never be just a Jane to me. I've never been a landowner before, I said. I'm sure you'll rise to the occasion, he teased gently. I smiled and looked at my patch of land. My land. The fog was rolling in from the bay, but in spite of the chill in the air, I felt warm clear through. This wild, rough, tumbling wilderness that had once seemed so terribly cold and unfriendly, now bourgeoned with hope and enterprise and friendship. And I can't be sure, but I swear I heard a voice in the waves crashing on the rocks below. Home, it whispered. I believe I would like the porch right here, I announced, my feet curling on the edge of the cliff. Jehu caught me to him, tucking his chin on my head, his arms safely around anchoring my waist. Fine place for a porch, he murmured. I elbowed him gently. And perhaps a garden over there? He stifled a grin. I know just the man to dig it out. I stared out at the bay rolling in, the gulls kissing the waves. I've been wondering about something, I said. I turned to him, tracing the scar on his cheek gently. What did you mean when you said that Mr. Russell was right about me? Jehu chuckled, smoothing my hand flat to his cheek. He pressed a kiss in the palm. Stop trying to distract me, I said, giving him a little push. Tell me. Jehu Scudder, the blue-eyed sailor who had stolen my heart, shook his head and smiled. He said, that gal is full of spit. Spit? He winked and then said in a fair imitation of Mr. Russell, and your gal. The Frink Hotel opened its doors to great fanfare in late winter. There was an opening day gala, and I was complimented by everyone on the beautifully appointed rooms as well as the delicious food. Mrs. Frink announced that my pies were to be the signature dessert of the hotel. Winter seemed to pass in a heartbeat, and spring arrived on the bay, bringing with it rainy days and settlers. New people seemed to be arriving daily, and not just men anymore. There were now several families with women and children, as well as a real doctor. Small houses were springing up everywhere. We were full to capacity at the hotel, and Father Joseph was thrilled to have so many new parishioners to attend his church. Jehu, who now acted as the harbor's pilot, guiding the arriving vessels through the many shoals, was building my house bit by bit. We spent our evenings in the cozy parlor of the hotel, where I was living until my house was ready. Jehu and Caruso intended to start a sawmill business together, but needed capital to do so. Jehu was planning to go to San Francisco sometime soon to find an investor for their venture. Spark was a frequent guest at Chief Toke's lodge, and on occasion she helped me at the hotel, where I enjoyed her company very much. She didn't speak English yet, but I spoke the jargon well enough to carry on conversation. She confided in me that while she found Caruso very easy on the eye, it was his sense of humor that attracted her. Sense of humor, I asked? She nodded seriously, her eyes dancing. He is most funny. He tells stories about you, Boston Jane, she confessed with a giggle. Stories? I asked, alarmed. Skunk stories, she said, and then burst into peals of laughter. At Mrs. Frink's urging, I gave Sudie the rag doll I'd made. The little girl was thrilled, and now often gave tea parties for both her dolls. Sudie adored the china doll, but it was the rag doll she dragged by the arm everywhere she went. so much so that the poor doll often lost its appendages and I was prevailed upon to doctor it. I confess the sight of that armless doll warmed my heart as nothing else ever could. Jane, Mrs. Frink said, looking up from the ledger she was writing in, would you mind going down to the beach? There's a schooner arriving that should have those extra dishes we ordered. If they're broken, I want them sent back directly on the same ship. Jehu's down there already. I was in the kitchen experimenting on a new concoction, salmon berry jam. Of course, I said, wiping my hands on my apron, happy for the opportunity to be outside on a day like this. As I made my way down to the beach, I passed Mr. Swan. Hello, my dear, he said. Capital day, don't you think? It's simply beautiful, I agreed. Mr. Swan cleared his throat nervously. Actually, I was looking for you. Yes? He handed me a piece of paper. What is this? I asked. The deed to the oyster bed. My dear, I am ashamed to say that I shall never be able to repay you for the money that here he swallowed hard, gambled away. I looked at Mr. Swan and remembered how his voice had shaken with fear when he defended me from Mr. Black. Mr. Swan, I sighed, handing him back the deed, I shall never find a partner as good as you. But my dear, I ruined everything. No, I said firmly, patting his hand. We are partners. I'm sure you can find some other way to pay back the money. Are you sure, my dear? He asked, a hopeful smile wreathing on his face. A lady always knows her own mind, Mr. Swan. He breathed a sigh of relief. Although I believe that I shall hold the money from now on, I added as an afterthought. He had the good grace to look sheepish, and then we both laughed. Where are you off to? He asked finally. The beach. There's a schooner arriving with some dishes we ordered from San Francisco. Oh, yes, he said, his white beard shining in the sun. And there are some passengers on the schooner, too, I believe. I smiled. We'll be a regular town in no time. Yes, I imagine we shall even have to have some elections soon. Elections? For mayor, judge, etc., he said, rubbing his beard thoughtfully. You'd make a wonderful mayor, I said. His eyes lit up at the suggestion. Do you really think so? Yes, I really do, I said. Now I must go. The boat will be arriving. As I walked away, I heard him murmur something to himself in a bemused voice. Mayor, what a capital idea. A light wind was whipping across the beach, bringing with it the scent of the sea. In the distance, the schooner had weighed anchor, and cargo and passengers were being lowered into Jehu's waiting rowboat. Sudi was perched on a boulder, playing with a small grouping of dolls. In addition to my doll and Mrs. Frink's doll, there were two new dolls, one fashioned from a clamshell and a rag doll most certainly acquired from one of the pioneer children. You sure have a lot of dolls there, I said, taking in the small pile. Yes, she said in a satisfied little voice. I traded. I have more dolls than any other girl. I am very rich. I see, I said. Sudi grinned up at me. But I like yours best. Chief Toke came walking over to us, and I nodded in greeting. He ruffled his daughter's silky hair. Sudi had piled a bunch of small pebbles in front of one of the dolls and was elaborately giving pebbles to the other dolls. What are you playing? I asked, curious. Potlatch. What's that? Chief Toke cleared his throat and said, Potlatch is ceremony giving gifts. Give everything away to guests. But why would you give everything away? I asked, confused. Then you will have nothing. You give things away and new things will be given to you, he said simply. Boss and Jane, Sudi said urgently, will you make new dress for this doll? She waved the new rag doll. With buttons, too. I met Chief Toke's eyes over Sudi's head and smiled. Perhaps he was right. I might have lost everything, but I had found more than I ever expected. You come to lodge for supper, Chief Toke said firmly. Of course, I said. Come, Sudi, he said, lifting her to the ground and helping her gather her dolls. I'll help you with the dress tomorrow, I promised Sudi. As they walked away, Chief Toke paused and turned to me. Boss and Jane, will you make me shirt like Jehu? The blue calico one? It is good shirt. And here he winked. Jehu won't trade it. I smiled at him and watched as father and daughter climbed out over the dunes, heading home. I perched on Sudi's boulder to wait, looking out at the bay, at the fast-moving clouds dancing across the sky. It seemed so strange to think that I was now a resident and landowner of this gentle stretch of wilderness. A rowboat was winging its way to shore through the waves. At its head, I spotted Jehu's familiar black hair. The settlers in the boat waved and shouted to me. I went down to the edge of the water to greet them, recalling how months before I had stood on this very same stretch of beach with my trunk packed, prepared to return to Philadelphia. When I was a child on Walnut Street, happiness had been the sound of Papa's voice. But here, a continent away, at the edge of the wilderness, happiness was Jehu's gruff laugh and Sudi's excited shout, and even the sound of Mr. Russell's spitting. I was the luckiest girl in the world. I heard everything now, the hum of the land, the soothing waves, and the excitement in the voices of the settlers with their hope of a new life. Yet one sound rang clear through above all others. A voice screeched across the water, sharp as glass. "Jane Peck!" I swear my heart stopped beating. Standing in the middle of the rowboat, blonde curls flying in the wind, head straining forward, was someone I truly thought I'd never see again in all my born days. Miss Sally Biddle of Philadelphia. The end. I hope you enjoyed Boston Jane Wilderness Days. There is a third one called The Claim, Boston Jane The Claim. So obviously it picks up where this leaves off with Sally Biddle coming to Shoalwater Bay. Wow. See you next time.